In April 1961, more than 1,000 Cuban exiles stormed the beaches at the Bay of Pigs to launch a revolt against Fidel Castro. Castro rose to power in the 1950s after years of training with his guerrilla army. On New Year's Day, 1959, Castro and his army invaded Havana, forcing US-backed leader Fulgencio Batista to flee the country. Castro declared himself prime minister and took control of the nation.
They surrounded him, engulfed him, clutched and clawed him. Fidel, our liberator, they roared. Fidel, our savior. It was January 1959.
With Castro in power, the relationship between the US and Cuba shifted dramatically. Castro signed a deal agreeing to buy oil from the Soviet Union. However, US-owned refineries in Cuba refused to process the Soviet oil.
Mikoyan also promised that the Soviet Union would ship crude oil to Cuba. American, British, and Dutch companies, which had drilled wells and built refineries in Cuba, refused to process the crude oil. Denouncing the foreign plutocrats who would impede the liberation of colonized people, Castro seized the oil companies.
The US then severed all diplomatic relations with Cuba. Within a year, Castro declared himself a communist, established a formal alliance with the Soviet Union, and took control of the remaining assets owned by Americans and foreign entities.
The Cuban premier completed his nationalization of an estimated $1 billion in United States-owned property.
With a communist state sitting just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to take action. He authorized the CIA to conduct a covert operation to cleanse Cuba of their new regime. The plan was simple: recruit Cuban exiles who lived in Miami to infiltrate the island and start an uprising. When the Kennedy administration took over, all signs pointed to the invasion being a massive success, but it wasn't. The inevitable failure began with the recruits. When Castro ascended to power, thousands of Cubans fled to Miami. To the CIA, these weren't refugees. They were future capitalist freedom fighters. Brigade 2506 was born. The recruits were trained in the art of guerrilla warfare. Some even had flying experience. But despite the extensive training, there was still one small problem: spies. Among the recruits were several double agents working for Castro. The plan was to start 2 days before the ground invasion, with exiled Cuban pilots infiltrating the Air Force and sabotaging Castro's air power from the inside. Then, the invasion forces would land in the old city of Trinidad because of its anti-communist beliefs and port facilities. But as the operation drew nearer, Kennedy called an audible. Nervous about the integrity of the plan's operational security, Kennedy moved the landing to the Bay of Pigs. The decision was a bit of a head-scratcher. Besides being one of Castro's favorite vacation spots, the bay was surrounded by swampland that would make it extremely difficult for locals to join the revolt. Despite the uncertainty, on April 15th, it was go time. Exiled Cuban pilots flew B-26 bombers, taking off from Nicaragua, and eliminated approximately 80% of Castro's combat aircraft inventory. Castro didn't believe that these pilots were members of his Air Force. He blamed the US and predicted that something much bigger was brewing. Castro ordered the population to seek shelter and lock themselves away to squash the possibility of an uprising.
In Cuba, charging the United States with arming and training mercenary forces for an imminent invasion. He calls out some 200,000 militiamen for training and guard duty.
After the bombing, Cuba's foreign minister called an emergency meeting of the United Nations.
Taking its case to the United Nations, Cuba seeks to put the United States on trial, charging his nation has been invaded by what he terms mercenaries from Guatemala and Florida.
Adlai Stevenson, US ambassador to the UN, claimed the US had no involvement in the attacks. Because nobody told him.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically.
After lying to the UN, the US walked a razor's edge. Kennedy canceled the rest of the airstrikes, but the ground invasion was to continue as planned. On the morning of April 17th, Brigade 2506 sailed toward the shore for their long-awaited homecoming. But things did not start off well. The ocean claimed a large amount of weapons and other equipment. When they reached the shore, they were met by roughly 20,000 Cuban armed forces, supported by the remaining combat aircraft that were spared the day prior. As Castro sank their ships and depleted their men, Brigade 2506 spiraled toward an epic defeat. Paratroopers missed targets, lost equipment, and suffered injuries. A few managed to barricade roads and hold their positions for 2 days. On April 19th, Kennedy authorized air support from 6 unmarked U.S. fighter planes. But they arrived an hour late due to the time change. The planes were shot down. Failure was inevitable. In the end, approximately 1,200 members of Brigade 2506 were captured, and about 100 were killed. Kennedy had to answer for his mistakes, and a settlement was reached to free the prisoners, $53 million worth of baby food. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion was a significant setback for the U.S. It was a massive blow to Kennedy's credibility and undermined his leadership in the eyes of many Americans and the world, making it difficult for him to pursue his policy objectives. The event also emboldened Castro and the Soviet Union, leading to increased tensions during the Cold War.
Friends, relatives, and companions of the ill-fated landing at the Bay of Pigs are reunited with the men.